A millionaire looked down on a fisherman, but learned a lesson that changed everything. How much do you make a month doing this? The voice cut through the salty morning air like a sharp razor. Miguel stopped arranging his nets and looked up. A middle-aged man, artificially tanned and wearing sunglasses that cost more than Miguel's boat, watched him with a condescending smile from the newly built pier. "Enough to live on, sir," Miguel replied calmly, returning to work. Richard Ashford III was not used to being ignored. CEO of Ashford Development Corporation, he had just purchased half of Cedar Bay's shoreline for his newest venture, a luxury resort that promised coastal authenticity for the global elite. The only problem was that small patch of beach where some stubborn fishermen insisted on maintaining their archaic operations. "You see, friend," Richard walked down from the pier with the confidence of someone who has never heard a genuine no in his life. "I'm making you a generous offer. $50,000 for your fishing license and the right to use this area. That's more money than you'll see in years of catching minnows." Miguel was 52 years old and had been fishing in those waters since he was 12. His father had fished there before him, and his grandfather before that. He knew every current, every sandbar, every secret that the ocean held on that specific stretch of coast. His calloused, sunburned hands told stories that men like Richard could never read. "It's not for sale," Miguel said simply, tying a rope with the precise movements that only decades of practice provide. Richard's smile disappeared. "You don't understand. It's not a request. The project has already been approved. In 6 months, this entire beach will be transformed. You can accept my offer now and walk out the front door, or you can be evicted and leave with nothing." "Fishing licenses are federal," Miguel replied, his tone still calm, but something changing in his eyes. "And this area has been protected for over 50 years. My family helped write these protections." Richard laughed, a dry, unpleasant sound. "Protections? My dear fisherman, you have no idea how the real world works. I've already talked to the right people. Your historical documents will turn out to be surprisingly flexible." In the following days, Miguel's life began to fall apart with an efficiency that only money and political connections can provide. First, it was a surprise health inspection that found serious violations in its refrigeration equipment that had passed every inspection for the past 10 years. Afterwards, his anchoring license was temporarily suspended due to documentary irregularities. Finally, on a Monday morning, 2 Coast Guard officers showed up with a court order. Miguel was prohibited from fishing within 3 miles of the coast, while an environmental investigation was conducted. Environmental investigation? Miguel looked at the documents in disbelief. "My family has protected these waters for 3 generations. Just following orders, Mr. Santos," the younger officer said, clearly uncomfortable. "Apparently there have been reports of overfishing and improper disposal of waste." That night, sitting on his anchored boat, Miguel received a message. It was from Richard, sent through a lawyer. "See how easy it is? My new offer, 30,000. Take it before you're left with nothing. People like you need to learn to recognize when they're defeated." Miguel read the message 3 times. Then, for the first time in weeks, he smiled. It wasn't the smile of someone defeated. It was the smile of someone who had just made a decision. As the sun set over Cedar Bay, turning the waters orange and red, Miguel opened a rusty metal box he kept under the seat of his boat. Inside were documents that his grandfather had entrusted to him years ago, saying, "Keep this, mijo. One day when greedy men come and try to steal what's ours, you'll need it." What Richard Ashford III didn't know, couldn't know, was that Miguel wasn't just a simple fisherman. He was the last keeper of a secret that had the power to transform that arrogant man from billionaire to pariah. And this story was just beginning. If you're enjoying this story about how greed can find its master in the most unexpected places, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, because what comes next will show that underestimating people based solely on appearances is the costliest mistake anyone can make. Over the next 3 days, Cedar Bay was invaded by construction trucks, surveying crews and press officers from Ashford Development, touting the future of luxury coastal tourism. Giant billboards promised seaside exclusivity, with digital renderings showing a private marina where the humble fishing pier worshippers used to exist. Miguel watched everything from afar, his boat anchored outside the exclusion zone imposed by the environmental investigation. Each morning, more workers arrived. Each afternoon, another part of the life I knew disappeared beneath concrete and empty promises of preservation of local character. "Sorry, Miguel," said Thomas Chen, owner of the restaurant where Miguel sold his catch 15 years ago. "Ashford bought the supply contract for the entire region. They will bring premium seafood from corporate distributors. They said, artisan fishing does not meet the quality standards of the new market." The same day, the bank called. His mortgage, paid religiously for 20 years, was being reassessed due to local zoning changes. The message was clear: Without income from fishing, there would be no way to pay. Without a home, I would have nowhere to live. Richard sent another message that night. New offer, 20,000. Last chance before you end up on the streets. By the way, how's the environmental investigation going? I heard it could result in heavy fines. That would be a shame, wouldn't it? Miguel didn't respond. Instead, he opened his old laptop and started doing something he hadn't done in years. Researching Ashford Development's names, companies, political connections, past projects. There was a pattern, and the more I looked, the more obvious it became. Cedar Bay was the 7th project in 10 years. In each previous case, entire coastal communities had been displaced. Fishermen, small traders, generational families, all swept up by sustainable development, which in reality meant 5-star resorts accessible only to the richest 0.1%. But there was something more between the lines of the newspaper articles and filed court cases. In 2 of the previous projects, residents had tried to resist. Their boats were mysteriously vandalized. Licenses disappeared. One particular fisherman in Maine had his gear destroyed in an accident that was never properly investigated. Grandpa, Miguel called his grandfather, now 87, living in a nursing home. I need to know everything about the documents you gave me. Everything. The elder's voice trembled slightly. I thought this day would never come, mijo. In the 1970s, when they wanted to build the oil refinery here, your great-grandfather and I fought alongside marine biologists to prove that these waters were a nursery for unique species. We got permanent federal protection for this specific coastal zone. I know, Grandpa, it's in the documents. But what you don't know, the old fisherman coughed, is that during that process, we discovered something else. There's a colony of rare coral 3 miles offshore, right where they want to build the marina. It's a species considered critically endangered. Any development within a 5-mile radius requires specific federal approval, and the process takes years. Miguel felt his heart accelerate. And Richard knows this? If he had done an honest environmental study, he would know. But I bet he paid someone to falsify the reports and speed up approvals. That night, Miguel did something he had never imagined doing. He called Rebecca Torres, an investigative journalist who had written a series of articles about predatory coastal development. She answered on the 3rd ring. Mr. Santos, I read about the situation in Cedar Bay. I was expecting your call. What do you mean waiting? Because Ashford Development has a standard, Rebecca explained, the sound of computer keys in the background. And you're exactly the kind of person they underestimate. Older man, traditional fisherman, no apparent political connections. They think they can just roll over you. Apparent, Miguel repeated the word, a small smile appearing for the first time in days. Exactly. So what do you have for me? Miguel spent the next 2 hours telling me everything. Grandfather's documents, the coral colony, the expedited approvals that appeared to have skipped crucial steps in the federal environmental process. Every word was recorded, every detail checked. This is bigger than Cedar Bay, Rebecca said finally. If we can prove that they falsified environmental studies, all previous projects can be reopened. We are talking about federal fraud on a massive scale. Meanwhile, Richard Ashford celebrated his latest victory in the bar of the region's most exclusive country club. Surrounded by investors and local politicians, he raised his glass of 40-year-old whiskey. Cedar Bay will be our crown jewel, he announced, the others applauding. In 18 months, when the resort opens, that forgotten place will be worth billions. What about that stubborn fisherman? Well, let's just say he finally learned that small fish don't survive in deep water. Laughter filled the mahogany-paneled room. What Richard couldn't see, at that exact moment, was Miguel sitting in his simple boat, Les, surrounded by scattered documents, talking to a federal environmental lawyer via video call. The lawyer, who specializes in coastal development fraud cases, smiled as he looked over the files Miguel had sent. Mr. Santos, do you understand what you have on your hands? This isn't just about saving your fishing license. This could bring down Ashford's entire East Coast operation. Miguel looked out over the dark waters of Cedar Bay, lit only by the crescent moon. His grandfather was right. That day had finally come. And men like Richard, so used to buying their way through any obstacle, were about to discover that some things are priceless. The next day, Rebecca Torres published her first article, Paradise for Sale: How Developers Are Using Environmental Fraud to Drive Out Coastal Communities. The article did not mention Cedar Bay specifically, but it established a clear pattern of predatory corporate behavior. Richard read the article over breakfast and dismissed it as sensational journalism. He sent another message to Miguel. Last offer, 15,000. Accept by tomorrow or you won't get anything. I've already organized the forced removal of your boat for next week. Miguel finally responded, no, one word. But there was the weight of 3 generations of fishermen who knew every secret of those waters, the weight of documents that proved federal fraud, the weight of an entire community that Richard thought he could simply erase from existence, the weight of a man who had just stopped running and started fighting. Richard laughed when he read the message. No? Did this pathetic fisherman really think one word would change anything? In his arrogance, he could not see what was about to crumble around him. He couldn't imagine that simple no was actually the first note in a symphony of consequences that he himself had composed. And what Richard Ashford III definitely didn't know was that at that very moment, federal marine life inspectors were already on their way to Cedar Bay, alerted by a detailed anonymous tip about possible habitat destruction for protected species. A storm was brewing on the horizon, but some men are so obsessed with looking down, trampling on those they consider inferior, that they forget to look up and see the darkening sky. The next morning, Miguel woke up before dawn, as he had done for 40 years, but this time it didn't go to sea. He went to the Cedar Bay Public Library, where he spent 6 hours scanning every document his grandfather had entrusted to him, creating backups on 3 different clouds and sending copies to Rebecca Torres and the federal attorney. You understand this goes beyond saving your boat, right? Said Dr. James Morrison, the federal environmental lawyer, during a video call that afternoon. We are talking about a process that can take years and costs that. It's not about the boat, Miguel interrupted softly. It never has been. It's about Cedar Bay. It's about every community Ashford has destroyed before ours. It's about doing the right thing, even when it costs everything. Dr. Morrison was silent for a moment. You remind me of my dad. He was a fisherman in Oregon before a lumber company bought the entire coast. His voice carried a weight of old memories. I will take your case pro bono, but I need you to understand. They will retaliate. And they retaliated. 2 days later, Miguel received an eviction notice. His home, purchased and paid for years ago, was being claimed through an obscure clause in the new zoning plan. He had 30 days to get out. It's not even legal, said Thomas Chen, the restaurant's owner, now an unlikely ally after being forced to close his family business when Ashford canceled its supply contracts. They can when they control the city council, replied Miguel, examining the documents. 3 of the 5 members received substantial campaign donations from Ashford in the last year. But Miguel was not alone. That night, 15 people gathered at Thomas's house. Fishermen, merchants, longtime residents of Cedar Bay. All had been harmed by Richard's development. My grandfather founded this town, said Sarah Martinez, owner of the only remaining bakery. I'm not going to let an arrogant billionaire turn it into a playground for people who don't even know how to fish. It was Sarah who suggested something crucial. My nephew works at City Hall. He said Ashford's environmental studies were approved in record time, 3 weeks when it normally takes 6 months. Someone sped up the process. Miguel felt a spark of hope. Do you think he would get copies of the approval documents? Already got it. Sarah slid a folder across the table. And there's more. The signatures on the I environmental impact, they belong to a consultancy company that has been listed as defunct for 2 years. Rebecca Torres published her second article the next morning. Ghost documents how developers use defunct companies to approve environmentally destructive projects. This time it mentioned Cedar Bay specifically. Richard Ashford was drinking coffee when his public relations officer burst into the office. Sir, we have a problem. That article about Cedar Bay is spreading on social media. Environmentalists are sharing it. Local influencers are talking about it. And Richard didn't even look up from his tablet. Hire a crisis management company. Release a statement about our commitment to sustainability. Donate $50,000 to a local NGO. Problem solved. Sir, there is more. Federal marine life inspectors were spotted at the site yesterday. Apparently they received a tip about a protected coral colony. Now Richard paid attention. Coral? Here? Impossible. Our environmental studies have not shown anything like that. Exactly, sir. And that's why the feds are investigating. If there is protected coral and we destroy it. Our studies were thorough, Richard cut in, but there was a note of uncertainty in his voice for the first time. We hire the best consultants. 3 days later, federal inspectors confirmed the existence of a colony of Oculina varicosa coral, a critically endangered species, exactly where the luxury marina was supposed to be built. Any development within a 5-mile radius would require years of additional environmental assessments and specific federal approvals. All construction in Cedar Bay was immediately suspended by federal order. Richard was furious. He called an emergency meeting with his lawyers, accountants, and the head of development. How did this happen? How come millions of dollars in environmental studies didn't detect a damn coral colony? Awkward silence filled the conference room. Sir, the lead lawyer began hesitantly. Reviewing the approval documents, there are irregularities. The company that signed the environmental impact studies, Eco Consult Solutions, appears as dissolved in state records since 2023. Richard's face turned red. What are you saying? I'm saying someone falsified the environmental studies, sir. And if the feds figure this out, we're not just talking about project delays. We're talking about criminal charges of federal fraud. That night, Richard sent his most aggressive message yet to Miguel. You don't know who you're messing with, old man. I will destroy you and your family of failed fishermen. Take 10,000 and get lost before I make sure you never fish anywhere in this country again. Miguel showed the message to Dr. Morrison, who smiled for the first time since taking on the case. Written threats? Perfect. He really can't help but incriminate himself, can he? He's used to always winning, Miguel observed calmly. Men like him don't know how to deal with real resistance. Rebecca Torres published her third article, this time with a devastating title. Ashford Development CEO threatens fishermen who exposed environmental fraud. Richard's message, shared anonymously, was reproduced in the article. Ashford Development shares fell 12% in a single day. Investors started asking questions. The board of directors called Richard to an extraordinary meeting. Environmental activists organized protests in front of the company's offices in 3 different states. But Richard, blinded by arrogance and anger, could only see one obstacle, that stubborn fisherman who refused to disappear. He could not have known that while his corporate lawyers were trying to contain the damage in the headlines, Dr. Morrison was compiling a federal case that documented a pattern of environmental fraud on 7 different projects over 10 years. I could not imagine that every threatening email, every intimidation attempt, every malicious legal action against Miguel was being meticulously documented and would be presented as evidence of systematic corporate malfeasance. And he definitely had no idea that the simple fisherman he so despised had spent the last 15 years serving on the state's Sustainable Fisheries Advisory Board, maintaining relationships with marine biologists, environmental protection officials, and, ironically, the federal senator who now chaired the Environmental Oversight Committee. The next night, Miguel sat on the deck of his boat, watching the calm waters of Cedar Bay under the moonlight. His phone rang. It was Senator Michael Chen, a distant cousin of Thomas, the restaurant owner. Miguel, I read the articles, and I received a copy of the documents you've compiled. There was admiration in the senator's voice. I'm calling for congressional hearings on coastal development fraud. Would you be willing to testify? Miguel looked toward the shore, where the lights of Ashford's buildings still glowed, temporarily paralyzed but not defeated. He thought of his grandfather, his father, all the generations who had protected those waters. Senator, it would be an honor. As he hung up, Miguel couldn't help but smile a little. Richard Ashford thought he was fighting an ignorant fisherman. In effect, he had declared war on an entire community, on decades of traditional knowledge protected by federal law, and on a man who understood that true strength comes not from how much money you have, but from how deep your roots are. The storm Richard had stirred up was about to turn into a hurricane, and he was so busy looking down on those he considered inferior, that he couldn't see the dark clouds forming directly above his head. Sometimes the most dangerous men aren't the ones who shout the loudest or have the biggest bank accounts. They are those who know every current in the ocean, who understand that patience is a form of power, and who know exactly when to let the tide turn. The Senate hearing began on a rainy Tuesday in March, broadcast live on C-SPAN and national news channels. Cedar Bay fisherman Miguel Santos sat before the Environmental Oversight Committee wearing his only dress shirt, his calloused hands resting on the witness table. Richard Ashford watched from the public gallery, his corporate lawyer at his side trying to look confident. It's political theater, Richard had told nervous investors that morning. A complaining fisherman trying to get his moment of fame. Tomorrow this will be forgotten. Senator Michael Chen opened the session. Mr. Santos, you presented documentation alleging systematic fraud in environmental studies related to Ashford development projects. Can you explain your findings? Miguel took a deep breath. For 3 hours, he presented evidence that Dr. Morrison and Rebecca Torres had helped compile. Documents showing that EcoConsult Solutions had been dissolved for 2 years when it allegedly conducted the Cedar Bay studies. Bank records revealing suspicious payments to city officials. Internal Ashford emails discussing accelerating approvals through alternative means. But it was when Miguel revealed his grandfather's documents that the room became completely silent. This is a letter from the National Marine Fisheries Service from 1974. Miguel held up the yellowed paper. Confirms the existence of federally protected habitat in Cedar Bay, specifically including the Oculina varicosa coral colony. Any development within a 5-mile radius requires direct federal approval. Objection! Ashford's lawyer stood up. These documents have not been independently verified. They were checked this morning by the National Marine Fisheries Service itself. Senator Chen interrupted, holding up a report. And they confirm every word of Mr. Santos's testimony. Furthermore, we discovered that this is not the first time that Ashford Development has forgotten to mention protected habitats in its environmental studies. Rebecca Torres published her most devastating article that afternoon. Senate hearing exposes decade of environmental fraud. Ashford CEO knew about protected coral. Internal emails reveal. Ashford shares plunged 34% in 2 hours. Richard was in his Manhattan penthouse when his phone exploded. First, it was the board of directors calling an emergency meeting. Then 3 main investors announcing they were withdrawing funds. Finally, the Department of Justice said it was opening a formal criminal investigation. "This is ridiculous," Richard shouted at his team of lawyers gathered in his room. "You said that the environmental studies were approved. You said there were no problems." "Sir," the lead attorney began hesitantly, reviewing the internal emails that were leaked. "There are communications from your own office instructing staff to simplify environmental reporting, specifically in Cedar Bay." The blood drained from Richard's face. "I've never been taken out of context. Sir, there is an email from you from January 18th saying verbatim, 'I don't care if there is choir or anything else there. Find a way to make this disappear from the report. We pay good lawyers for exactly that.'" Dead silence in the room. "We need to prepare a criminal defense," the lawyer finally said. "Federal environmental fraud can result in up to 10 years in prison and millions in fines." That night, Richard did something he had never imagined. He called to Miguel directly. His voice was hoarse, desperate. "How much do you want to make this stop? 1 million? 2 million? Name your price." Miguel was on his boat when he answered, surrounded by Thomas Chen, Sarah Martinez, and other Cedar Bay residents. He activated the speakerphone. "Mr. Ashford, I'm not for sale. I never have been." "You don't understand," Richard practically screamed. "This will destroy my company. Hundreds of jobs. Billions in investments." "I understand perfectly," Miguel replied calmly. "You built an empire by cheating environmental laws, expelling entire communities from their ancestral homes, and destroying protected ecosystems. And when a simple fisherman tried to stop you, you thought you could crush me like a bug. I was just doing business." "No, sir. You were committing crimes, and now you're going to pay for them." Richard tried another approach. "That fisherman in Maine, that one in Oregon, I gave them all fair compensation. They took the money." "Fair compensation?" Miguel's voice became hard for the first time. "You destroyed their lives, their communities, their traditions, and you thought a few dollars would make it all go away. But with me, Mr. Ashford, you made a fatal mistake." "What mistake?" "You underestimated how much a man is willing to fight when he defends not just his livelihood, but his dignity, his history, and the future of his community." Richard hung up. His hands were shaking. For the first time in his adult life, he had no control over the situation. He couldn't buy, bully, or sue his way out of this problem. In the following days, Richard's empire collapsed with astonishing speed. The Justice Department expanded its investigation to include all 7 of Ashford Development's previous projects. They discovered identical patterns of fraud, falsified environmental studies, bribed municipal officials, entire communities illegally displaced. 3 state governments filed separate lawsuits. The EPA, Environmental Protection Agency, announced that it was reviewing all environmental approvals granted to Ashford over the past decade. But it was the board of directors that delivered the final blow. In an extraordinary meeting, they voted unanimously to remove Richard as CEO, citing systematic corporate misconduct and serious ethical violations. "You can't do this." Richard looked in disbelief at the faces around the table, people he had hired, promoted, enriched. "I built this company from scratch, and you built it on fraud," said coldly Janet Morrison, now interim CEO. "Ashford Development will survive, Richard, but only if you leave, immediately." The next morning, Rebecca Torres published the photo that would become iconic. Richard Ashford leaving the corporate building of the company he founded, carrying a cardboard box with his personal belongings, his face pale and defeated. The headline, "Billionaire Falls, How a Fisherman Toppled an Empire Built on Lies." Meanwhile, in Cedar Bay, something extraordinary was happening. Ashford's new CEO, in a desperate attempt to save the company's reputation, announced the complete cancellation of the resort project. More than that, he donated all the land already purchased to an environmental conservation fund, establishing Cedar Bay as a permanent preservation area. "It's the right thing to do," Janet Morrison said at a press conference, clearly trying to distance the company from Richard's toxic legacy. Ashford Development recognizes the mistakes of the past and is committed to making amends with the communities we have harmed. Miguel received the news while preparing his boat for his first day of fishing in months. His license had been fully restored, with a formal apology from the Coast Guard. Thomas Chen appeared at the pier holding a tablet. "Miguel, you need to see this." It was a statement from the governor's office. Miguel Santos was being appointed to the new State Coastal Preservation Council, created specifically to prevent cases like Cedar Bay from happening again. We recognize, the statement said, that the best environmental protections come from people who intimately understand the ecosystems we seek to preserve. The traditional knowledge of fishing communities is irreplaceable. Sarah Martinez came running out of breath. Miguel, CNN, MSNBC, 3 national newspapers, they all want interviews. You have become a national symbol of community resistance against predatory corporate development. But perhaps the sweetest twist came a week later. Richard Ashford, now without a company, without a fortune, frozen by multiple lawsuits, and without a reputation, showed up at Cedar Bay in person. Miguel found him on the same pier where it all started. "I came to apologize," Richard said, and for the first time his arrogance was completely gone. Entity. He looked like he had aged a decade in a few months. "You were right about everything. I lost everything. My company, my money, my family." His voice broke. "My wife filed for divorce. My children don't talk to me. Friends I cultivated for decades disappeared overnight." Miguel studied the man before him, so different from the arrogant billionaire who had scorned him months ago. "Mr. Ashford, I didn't do it to destroy you. I did it to save my community. But you chose to build your fortune by trampling on people you considered insignificant. The consequences are yours, not mine." "I know," Richard nodded, tears in his eyes. "I just needed you to know that I finally understand. What you have here, your community, your traditions, your respect for this land, is worth more than anything I've tried to build, and I was too arrogant to see that." He extended his hand. Miguel hesitated, then squeezed her briefly. "I hope you find a better path from now on, Mr. Ashford. A path that doesn't involve destroying other people's lives." Richard waved and walked away, his shoulders hunched, the silhouette of a completely broken man. As the sun set over Cedar Bay, dyeing the waters gold and crimson, Miguel sat on the deck of his boat. All around him, the community he had saved was beginning to rebuild. The pier would be renovated, not demolished. Fishermen would return to the waters. Traditions would continue. His phone rang. It was his grandfather, from the nursing home. "You did good, mijo." The trembling voice was full of pride. "Your great-grandfather would be so proud. You proved that protecting what we love isn't just about having money or power. It's about having the courage to stand up to those who think they can buy everything." Miguel smiled, looking at the stars starting to appear in the darkened sky. He had started this journey just wanting to save his right to fish, but in the process he had proven something much greater, that a single person, armed with truth, courage, and a united community, can topple giants who seem untouchable, and that lesson would echo far beyond Cedar Bay, inspiring other communities to rise up against those who would try to steal not just their land, but their dignity. The battle was won, but the war for justice, Miguel knew, was eternal, and now he had a platform to fight not just for Cedar Bay, but for every coastal community facing the same fate that nearly destroyed his own. Richard Ashford had tried to teach Miguel how the real world works. In the end, it was Miguel who taught Richard the dearest lesson of all, that unprincipled power always crumbles, and that true strength comes not from how much you have, but from why you fight. 6 months after the Senate hearing, Cedar Bay was unrecognizable, but not in the way Richard Ashford had imagined. The Fisherman's Pier, which he had tried to demolish, now bore a bronze plaque, "Miguel Santos Marine Preservation Center, protecting our waters since 1974. Tourists came from all over the country not for a luxury resort, but to learn about ocean conservation from traditional fishermen who knew every secret of those waters. Miguel woke up at 5 in the morning as he always did, but now after his morning fishing he headed to the State Coastal Preservation Board office, where his decades-long experience finally had an official voice in the decisions that shaped the future of communities like his. "We've received another request," Dr. Morrison said during a video call, smiling. "Fishermen in Oregon want to know if you can travel there. They are facing a similar situation with another developer." Miguel looked out the window at the calm waters of Cedar Bay. "Of course, no one else should have to go through what we went through." Thomas Chen reopened his restaurant, this time as a community cooperative where local fishermen were members. On Friday nights, the place was packed with tourists wanting to try truly sustainable seafood, caught using traditional methods that respect the ocean. Sarah Martinez expanded her bakery, hiring 3 new employees from the community. "Funny," she commented to Miguel one morning. "Richard thought development meant destroying what was there. We discovered that true development means strengthening the roots that were already here." Rebecca Torres won the Pulitzer Prize for her investigative series about coastal development fraud. In his acceptance speech, he dedicated the award to communities like Cedar Bay that prove that resistance isn't stubbornness, it's deep love for what really matters. As for Richard Ashford, His fall was as spectacular as his empire had been impressive. The Department of Justice indicted him on 17 federal charges: environmental fraud, bribery of public officials, falsification of federal documents, and conspiracy to illegally displace protected communities. The trial lasted 8 weeks and resulted in conviction on all charges. 15 years in federal prison, the judge announced. Mr. Ashford, you built an empire on the deliberate ruin of entire communities. You used wealth and connections to trample laws designed to protect our natural and cultural heritage. This sentence reflects not only the gravity of your crimes, but the arrogance with which they were committed. But the arrest was just the beginning of Richard's consequences. His personal fortune, estimated at $2.3 billion, was almost completely consumed by federal fines, civil lawsuits from the communities he destroyed, and court-ordered restitution. What was left was divided in the divorce, leaving Richard with less than $1 million, a tiny fraction of what he had owned. His 3 adult children legally changed their surnames, publicly cutting all ties with their father. "We grew up believing our father was a visionary," his eldest daughter said in an interview. "To discover that he built our comfortable lives on the suffering of others, there are no words to express this shame." The Ashford Development Corporation, under new management, spent the next 2 years undoing Richard's legacy. 6 coastal projects were canceled or drastically redesigned to include community participation. The company established a $500 million fund to compensate harmed communities and finance environmental preservation. But perhaps the most painful consequence for Richard was absolute social ostracism. Elite social circles that adored him when he was a billionaire instantly disappeared. The country club revoked his membership. Friends for decades blocked his number. He became an outcast, a public example of how wanton greed and arrogance inevitably lead to ruin. A year after his conviction, Richard received an unexpected visitor in federal prison. Miguel Santos crossed the living room and sat down opposite the man who had tried to destroy him. Richard was visibly older, his hair gray, his shoulders hunched, a pathetic shadow of the arrogant executive who had snubbed a fisherman on that pier. "Why did you come?" Richard asked, genuinely confused. "After everything I've done. Because my grandfather taught me that justice is not about hate, it's about responsibility." Miguel studied the man before him. "You are paying for your crimes, but I came here to say something that needs to be said." Richard waited silent. "You had it all. Money, power, influence. You could have used these tools to build incredible things, uplift communities, protect the environment while creating prosperity. Instead, you chose to crush anyone who stood in your way. Not because you had to, but because you could." Tears began to stream down Richard's face. "I know. God, I know. Every night here, I think about all the people I've harmed, the families I've destroyed, the ecosystems I've damaged, and why? For money I no longer need? For ego? The question is, what will you do with the next 15 years? Miguel leaned forward. "You can spend this time regretting it, or you can find some way to make amends. Write your story. Tell other ambitious young executives how greed destroyed you. Use your experience to warn about the dangers of corporate arrogance." Richard wiped his eyes. "You are more generous than I deserve. It's not about what you deserve. It's about breaking the cycle." Miguel got up to leave. "Men like you appear in every generation, thinking they can buy their way through any obstacle. Someone needs to tell them the true cost of these choices." Months later, Richard began writing. His brutally honest autobiography, Empire of Sand, How Arrogance Destroyed Everything I Built, has become required reading in business ethics programs at universities across the country. Every penny of royalties was donated to coastal preservation funds. Back in Cedar Bay, Miguel sat on the deck of his boat on a golden autumn afternoon. His 8-year-old grandson, also named Miguel, was learning to tie fisherman's knots, the same lesson he had received from his grandfather decades ago. "Grandpa," the boy asked, "is it true that you fought a billionaire and won?" Miguel smiled. "I didn't fight alone, little one. An entire community fought, and we didn't win because we were richer or more powerful. We won because we stood for something bigger than ourselves. The ocean? The ocean, yes, but also our history, our traditions, our way of life, and the idea that some things can't be bought or destroyed no matter how much money someone has." Miguel's phone rang. It was the governor, asking if he could lead a new statewide coastal preservation initiative with a $50 million budget. Miguel smiled as he accepted, realizing the irony. Richard had spent fortunes trying to remove him from Cedar Bay, and now he had government resources to protect dozens of Cedar Bays across the state. As the sun set, dyeing the water's impossible shades of orange and purple, Miguel reflected on the extraordinary journey. He had started out as a simple fisherman who Richard considered an insignificant obstacle. He ended up as a national voice for community and environmental preservation, proving that underestimating people based on prejudice is the most expensive mistake anyone can make. The best revenge, Miguel told his grandson, is not destroying those who wronged you. It is building something so significant, so lasting, that their evil becomes just a footnote in the story of your victory. Little Miguel nodded seriously, not fully understanding yet, but absorbing the wisdom that would one day guide his own choices. And so, Cedar Bay thrived, not as a playground for billionaires, but as a beacon demonstrating that communities rooted in respect for the land and ocean will always trump those who see nature as a commodity to be exploited. That traditional knowledge has invaluable value that no corporate consultancy can replicate, that human dignity is priceless. Richard Ashford had tried to teach Miguel a lesson about power. In the end, it was Miguel who taught the entire world a lesson about true strength. It doesn't come from bank accounts or political connections, but from deep roots, unshakable principles, and the courage to stand up for what's right even when it seems impossible. 3 years after the start of that battle, Miguel Santos was no longer just a fisherman from Cedar Bay. He was a living symbol that an ordinary person, armed with truth and determination, can face giants and win. That united communities are stronger than billion-dollar corporations. That justice, although it sometimes takes time, eventually prevails. And that lesson, far more valuable than any luxury resort, would echo for generations, inspiring countless others to rise up against those who think power and money make them untouchable. If this story of courage, justice, and the triumph of human dignity over corporate greed has touched your heart, subscribe to the channel. Because in the real world, stories like Miguel's happen every day, and some victories need to be celebrated, remembered, and shared to inspire the next generation of ordinary people doing extraordinary things. After all, true legacy is not measured in dollars or property, but in the lives we touch, the communities we protect, and the courage we inspire in others to never, ever give up on what truly matters.